Hello, this is Paperweight Gaming here, and I wanted to take my time to talk about my experience with the Marathon Server Slam. So, the first topic I want to talk about is the PvE in the game. I felt that it was actually rather decent, seeing as how from the weakest enemy to the strongest actually felt like a challenge, requiring different strategies to take them out, especially the bosses that would appear later on in the game. I also like the approach to combat, seeing as how it's left to the player's choice as to whether we go in guns blazing, or we can actually use stealth. I was actually rather surprised about this, as most games go with the way of when one enemy notices you, it feels like the entire lobby notices you. But not in this one. If you actually manage to take out that first enemy, you can actually still save it and go for a complete stealth run and get out of there without alerting any other guard in the area. However, if you do want to go in guns blazing, I do like the fact that the game does not let you overstay your welcome either, as weaker enemies will call in more elite ones, and as I stated earlier, they do require more strategy to take out. I do like the fact that they took their time to make sure that these elite enemies actually felt elite, and that they do take time to take out. However, I will state that there was one that did kind of get on my nerves, the one that constantly spams grenades all the time, as it made it rather difficult to hide behind cover or try to take out in general, as it could just spam the area with grenades so quickly. But besides the grenadier enemy type being rather annoying to deal with, I would like to take the time to talk about the Wraith Warden, a random boss that appears in Perimeter every now and then. At Dante's Dingus, I and a friend of ours called LK decided to hunt it down to see what kind of loot it had. When we did, however, we found out that the boss fight is no joke. We actually got beat up pretty badly, ended up using a lot of our resources, but in the end we were able to swing the fight in our favor and actually beat the boss. The boss held quite a bit of loot, guns, various gun parts, which will come into play later. But all in all, I did enjoy the boss fight and its mechanics. Up next, I'd like to take some time to talk about the weapons in the game. I learned this from Dante's when we were looting around. He managed to get weapons parts for his gun. When he equipped them all, he found out that it changed the rarity of his weapon. I thought this was pretty cool, because most games you usually have to happen across the next rarity. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not always a bad thing depending on the game, but I thought the way that Marathon did this was pretty interesting. I would also like to add that I do like how the game puts an emphasis on taking your time while checking the map. However, this does bring us to our next portion of the game that we would like to talk about. The dangers of lingering too long in one area, and the PvP side of things. So like I said before, lingering in an area can be beneficial to grabbing more loot. The only problem with this is the longer you stay in an area, the enemies will respawn, and we did notice that it tends to drop more elite enemies. The problem with this as well, though, is you don't want to linger in an area for that long, because the enemies will be tougher. But this will also attract PvP players, who can loot you if they manage to kill you, and you will lose all your loot if you get eliminated. However, if you manage to turn the tide of that fight, you can loot them instead. This usually results in a big jump in one's gear due to the fact that you never know how much each player has looted the map. This is how Dante's and I managed to get a lot of better gear when we had to fight, but we also knew when to call it quits and get out of an area. Another thing I would like to add about PvP portion of things is that sometimes when spawning in on other maps, it would prove to our disadvantage that sometimes it would spawn us way too close to enemy teams right off the bat and we would get murked instantly. It wasn't too bad, but it did come off annoying when those rounds kind of happened back to back. However, there were times we were able to turn being spawned in near enemy teams to our advantage. This allowed us to take their loot plenty of times. Another thing that we also found out, which was pretty cool, was that we can use what are called starter kits. This allowed us to start fresh with basic weapons, basic gear, and allowed us to keep what we really valued in our vault without having to risk losing it in a run. We use this strategy a lot in order to basically go as what we called 0 to hero, basically starting from nothing and then getting everything at the end of a run. This strategy came in handy a lot when just trying to figure out the maps, where to go, and where other loot items were telling us we needed to go. or in case we had a bad run and came across too many enemy players. Another thing I would like to highlight about the game are the weapons. Surprisingly, I found myself enjoying all of them, as they were all really decent across the board, including the knife. I didn't think the knife would be much of a thing, especially as the game is using guns, so I thought it'd be more mid to far distance play. The fact that I was able to use the knife more often, and when I felt like it, was actually pretty cool. And that it doesn't feel wasted. Another thing I would like to talk about on the game are the characters that you can play as themselves. As you see on screen, Dantes is playing as what is called a destroyer. His class is meant to protect the team, or themselves, if playing solo, via a shield and a rocket bombardment system that when activated while firing, you shoot rockets at your opponent, which I thought was pretty cool and came in handy for a lot of times when coming up against enemy team players. The shell I'm playing as is called an assassin. Of course, the usual, I go invisible, but I can use that to my advantage to either get in or out of a sticky situation. Another one I liked playing as the most, probably my favorite out of all of them, is the triage shell. His ability to revive players rather quickly, along with the med drone, and his super, basically as we'll call it, allows me to instantly revive downed players. I thought that was pretty handy, especially as it came in clutch for particular rounds where we're getting swarmed by not only massive amounts of PvE enemies, but also PvP players at the same time. Another character I liked playing as is called Recon. Of course, as it is in the name, this character scopes out the environment for any enemies, PvE or PvP. The cool thing about this is they have an ability in where they can scan the environment, revealing any invisible enemies as well. This also goes for PvP players. Very handy if you've got some assassins in the area. The only problem I encountered while playing this character, in which I don't know if anybody else did, was that they also have another ability called a heat-seeking drone. This is supposed to be deployed to catch any other enemy PvP players off guard, because when you are sprinting, you have what's called a heat meter. When this maxes out, you cannot run, and it prevents you from moving or escaping. The problem with this is that whenever I would use the heat-seeking drone, it would tend to glitch out and get stuck in the floor, or it would freak out and stick to the ceiling and then just explode without chasing down any nearby players. So that kind of sucked. But I did enjoy the shell nonetheless. Another thing about the game that is actually pretty cool is you can complete what are called contracts. By completing these random objectives that it gives you, you can get different rewards. Sometimes free starter kits, other times massive amounts of loot. The problem with these contracts, though, that I did notice is that some of the objectives that it gives tells you to go do certain things, but not where or how. This kind of gets annoying, especially in a round that only lasts about 20 minutes or less, depending on how well your run is going, and especially depending on how many times you have to try. Another thing I want to stop and talk about real quick is the game's story itself. I found it rather interesting how the game starts by telling us we lost contact with the Marathon itself at 100 years ago. But when we come back, due to a distress signal, we find that there's pretty much no one here. All the buildings and everything is here, the research equipment, whatnot, even the UESC. But the problem is, there's no one else. It gives off very big Roanoke vibes, and I'm kind of wondering what else goes on. Now I know that you can continue to get the rest of the story by finding collectibles hidden throughout the game while you're on your run, but to be fair, who's going to be looking for those whilst you're trying to get your loot, get out, not get shot by enemy players or even PvP players before your round is over in 20 minutes or less? This is why I agree with Dantes in a conversation that we had that maybe having a campaign mode would be better for telling its story, while having the PvP/PvE mode as a separate mode could be a good thing. Now that's just our thought on it. You'll have to say what you think about it on the comments below. But that's our thought. So to wrap up this video, I'm going to be honest, I didn't go into Marathon Server Slam having high hopes about the game, especially because of the whole art plagiarism thing that happened before. I am kind of surprised how much PlayStation doubled down on the game to make sure that it was rebuilt properly. And to be honest, I'm not gonna lie. During the server slam, I had fun playing the game with Dante's kids and our friend that we call LK. And some other people I met along the way when playing some other rounds without them. I talked to these people because surprisingly, they were chatty. And when they did, they told me what they liked about the game. When I talked to them further and asked them what they did actually like about it, they said that they liked how the game looked and how it wasn't as dark as other looter-shooter extraction games, and that they found the gameplay quite fun as well, along with the variety of characters. Now, I'm not gonna lie. For a game that does a rinse and repeat kind of cycle of getting your loot, losing your loot, getting it back, I will say that the gameplay was fun. But I do not believe it is worth the $40 price tag, nor the amount of suffering Destiny 2 has gone through to get this up and running. Now, with that, don't let my negative opinions dissuade you on trying out the game. If you want to try it out, that's up to you. I still enjoyed a rather positive playthrough of the server slam. However, that's my opinion for now. We'll see what it does later on. On to the credits!